For this episode, we recommend that you use headphones to fully immerse yourself in this global conversation linking North America, Europe, and Asia as we bring you the world's first 8D podcast series. Welcome to Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers. I'm Chloe Cho. This is part 5, the final episode of our special series delving into the implications of the coronavirus pandemic.
I don't know why I have not seen such a crisis in my lifetime. I just remember my grandmother telling me so many stories about the Second World War, which was certainly one of the biggest crises on the planet.
This is meaningfully worse than the financial crisis and the dot-com crisis kind of put together. If it weren't for the actions of the government, this would lead to a stock market rout of unprecedented proportions.
Certainly it is a black swan event insofar as very few saw this coming. The impact is profound and incredibly high. But the argument that I make that this is actually in some ways just another canary in the coal mine is that it presents a challenge that defies traditional boundaries, traditional national boundaries, traditional geographic boundaries.
And I think it's really important framing for what then happens in terms of human beings and human behavior. We have a health crisis, which is triggered by the COVID virus and the disease. That health crisis has triggered an economic crisis. The third crisis is a mental health crisis.
We are in a state of so-called war. We are in a state where people's lives are in risk. How do we facilitate the sharing of data? How do we facilitate the sharing of models?
It's a new ontology, so it's a new paradigm. And so we're in the age of data.
The way we conduct business, how businesses around the world think about their supply chain, I think this will have a huge impact in our lifetime.
I think the focus has really shifted towards the question of sustainable supply chains packaged in that security question as opposed to simple considerations about population growth and consumption profiles.
What we've learned through the series is that what seemed like an unprecedented and unforeseen crisis was actually forewarned and foreseen, and that there were parallels in history. The chaotic experience has also taught us what has preceded us, be it war, plague, or famine. We can only learn and understand through the account of historians. Never before in recent history has the world been more curious about the economic, social, and psychological implications of a pandemic, and there have been different interpretations of how plagues have impacted civilization. Here's venture capitalist, entrepreneur, and author Brad Feld, who's shared a candid personal perspective of how a triple crisis in the form of health, mental health, and economic turmoil can unsettle societies through stress and anxiety.
And a complex system has a bunch of characteristics, including as you generate outputs from the inputs of a complex system, those outputs become inputs into the next wave of action. And you really can't predict the outcome. You can't say this is when the end point is, or once you get to this, then you're good, or you've been successful. It's this very dynamic, ever-changing thing. It has a lot of categories or principles like emergent behavior, where all of a sudden behaviors come out of nowhere that you didn't expect. For better or for worse, there's a fundamental principle of complex systems called contagion, and there's both positive and negative contagion. COVID is a contagion. And the dynamic of the COVID crisis is a complex system. And knowing that, it's very hard to say, here's how you address it top down.
What is a corporation's obligation and responsibility for mental health, for personal resilience? This is, I think, a new area. It's also accelerated by kind of an existing and growing class of employee wellness offerings. But again, we have sort of new context around that. What is a social safety net? What are the obligations and responsibilities of the government to its citizens, and also of the government to the private sector? These questions have a renewed call and I think a renewed interest as we work towards a perhaps more resilient or agile state of being for the next coming number of years.
That's Jessica Groopman, founding partner of Kaleido Insights, as the coronavirus crisis that's left more than 100,000 dead in the United States could be the historical event that tilts American society into a more socially conscious shift in the form of universal healthcare and retirement schemes, much like Europe, which embraced a stronger social safety net after World War II trauma. As countries, one after another, ease out of lockdowns, the ramifications of this crisis could resonate for decades, according to Toby Ruckert, founder and CEO of UIB, a conversational AI platform.
I would not underestimate the mental health aspect of this crisis. They're probably far more consequential than the physical ones. There will be a whole generation of school kids, for example, where the learning would have changed and where they were not able to see their friends and where basically a whole network of support has broken away. There will be a lot of elderly who have not been visited by their sons and grandchildren for a really long time. There are so many society consequences that will have mental health consequences for us for decades to come. So I think if China is trying to create gimmicky solutions to deal with this, there may be a reason for this. They have been under lockdown longer.
From gimmicky solutions to contact tracing, which is being used to battle a second wave of infections, there's been a stirring of protests around the world as tempers flare over virus-related restrictions that can portend turbulence as economies collapse. The situation reminds Rob van Kranenburg, founder of the IoT Council, of the nightmarish vision described by French philosopher Michel Foucault on how societies historically exercised surveillance to deal with threats to public health, lepers and plagues.
I've been reading lately again, rereading a book by Tigun. It's called This Is Not a Program. And that's quoting Foucault on the difference between the leper and the plague. And so for the leper, there was banishment, and for the plague, there was control. So Foucault is talking about what happened during the plague, which is like hundreds of years ago. Everything was locked down into grids. Everybody was registered, and each citizen was awarded their own window. So if you were not at the window, you're probably in bed. You were a menace. But this situation is kind of a default situation that we've had. But the big difference then is that you would present yourself for that window, but now we're representing ourselves through windows, which is basically in our apps. We should be basically kickstarting ourselves into a new position of power where we should have at least a third say in between governments or companies. We're proposing the notion of disposable identities.
As coronavirus surveillance erodes privacy, AI and data scientist David Hardoon says while the technology is available to anonymize data, the world needs to exercise a dose of pragmatism in times of crises.
Is one's privacy worth the cost of another's life? That is an exceptionally difficult question, but I would say, well, we need to be a bit more lenient by saying that, yes, we need to adhere to privacy. We need to make sure there is a certain robustness that we will always lean towards, but there needs to be flexibility, especially we're dealing with a situation whereby people are dying effectively. So it's having a bit of both worlds to a certain extent.
The jury is still out on COVID-19's impact on civil liberties, and the outcome may depend on how countries deal with the second wave of infections, according to David Williams, founder and CEO of Williams Capital Advisors.
The true believers on both sides aren't going to change their positions. If many months go by and the US and Europe still have an ongoing problem with new infections and with the ability to trace where those infections came from and who those people were in contact with, and if at the same time China sees a lower and lower number of new cases per day, you're going to start to see a very stark comparison in terms of China's lower protections on individual privacy being outweighed by their ability to keep the virus under control, and that may sway some minds in the middle.
With coronavirus cases numbering 5.5 million and counting, and more than 360,000 dead, as reopenings get underway, much remains to be seen whether civil disobedience will magnify into a larger societal phenomenon or even extremism. just as a collective trauma post the 1918 Spanish flu has recently been linked to the rise of the Nazi Party, according to research by a New York Federal Reserve economist. What complicates matters in this fragile situation is possible tension as industries accelerate the adoption of AI, robotics, IoT, machine learning, and 3D printing to pandemic-proof operations. Will the transition trigger unrest, much like the early 1800s when the original Luddites emerged to rage against the use of machines, and later in the 1920s when unrest erupted to oppose mass production for taking jobs away?
We're going to see unemployment going to keep growing, I think, in coming weeks, probably as big as or potentially greater than we saw in the Great Depression. So yes, that can lead to unrest. Now the hope is that this is all very temporary and in a few months that most of these people will be back at work. I'm not so sure that that's the case.
Society could be broken by this inability of the state to deal with the digital. So what do? Well, they start disciplining. That's all they know. That's what they can do. So there's this kind of militarization of society. This will hasten the downfall of these systems even more. Because what they have in front of them is not citizens from the Middle Ages or citizens from 1700 or citizens from 1800. What they have in front of them is solution architects that these citizens are, who have now even far more or better tools than they ever had.
Some recent demonstrations have seen protesters with weapons and 5G telephone towers burnt down, swept up in conspiracy theories that radiation was to blame for spreading the virus to force vaccinations. There is no question that individuals feel empowered today with an array of tools and gadgets at their disposal, but the public health menace has also revealed the limits of technology.
Certainly, when you look back over the course of history, these kinds of crises prompt not just shifts in technology and innovation, but also shifts in what we think about as a safety net or even workers' rights. No one can say how this is going to play out for sure, but this is really sort of two historical tensions colliding together. The drive towards robotics and AI and all of those automation technologies is only accelerated. That said, AI and automation generally does lack and has a lot of limitations that humans are still far superior at. So in some ways, perhaps the future of work will really shift to different kinds of skills where machines and AI and automation are simply just not to the task.
As businesses reopen, Jeffrey Tiong, founder and CEO of PatSnap, an AI-driven patent analytics platform, says there is a spike in litigation and data sharing, which is a sign that companies are in crisis mode.
Very early indicator shows that the patent litigation is increasing. And this is the same back in 2008, 2009 financial crisis as well. And the logic is this. So during economic downturn, company will definitely try to maximize every asset they have, including their IP assets. They would like to monetize it. So the litigation activity, we are seeing a trend of going up in the next couple months. The other is also, especially in the medical device healthcare industry, companies start collaborating more, in fact, to open up their IP and let everyone access. Just an example, Medtronic, they are the world #1 medical device company, and they have actually opened up their whole IP on how to make a ventilator. So everyone basically can use their IP to manufacture a ventilator.
In terms of data usage, David Hardoon says the world needs to take a digital personalization approach, very much like the predictive analysis we are used to when given recommendations for purchases on Amazon or movie preferences on Netflix.
Just as you have the ability of identifying one person's preference, we are able to identifying an individual's risk to contracting corona or susceptibility to corona. So the idea behind it is, can we use the information, the patterns, the data that's being generated across the board for pattern usage, for purchase usage? For example, are you buying certain medications? Are you exhibiting certain patterns, going to certain locations? Have you been in the proximity of certain individuals? If I'm able to identify the degrees of my population and how they will react, I may be better yet to kind of identify how many beds I need in ICU, how many ventilators, and how to best deploy them effectively, as well as test. So it becomes a lot more specific. It becomes a lot more personalized rather than a brush stroke of, I'm going to do the same thing for everyone.
How quickly can this data-driven digital personalization approach be applied, and can it scale?
Oh, absolutely. It's one thing that was happening in China. They would literally look at people's shopping patterns and what they were purchasing, and they were identifying that certain people who were purchasing certain types of items may, and that's the key word there, may have been either already infected with COVID or have a high susceptibility of COVID, or dealing with someone in their households and the vicinity that may have COVID. And that information becomes very informative in how to actually engage them. What is necessary now is the means of how to bring it together, from a tracing, from a diagnosis, from identification. How to bring this information together and how to start leveraging and using it. From a policy perspective, from a framework, due to privacy, due to protection, those may not be entirely there to allow for it. But data is there. It just needs to be used.
What the COVID-19 crisis has revealed is the importance of data and the extent to which societies can use personal data for the broader well-being. Rob van Kranenburg says what is happening today spells a new paradigm, something that he saw coming as far back as 20 years ago, which prompted him to eventually set up the IoT Council.
About 21 years ago, I went to a conference and I saw this community that actually had some history when it was called pervasive computing, ubiquitous computing. Sort of this was all the Internet of Things people, and I sort of realized that they were going to build some kind of a digital twin of the environment. They were talking about tagging things and sort of building connectivity and processes and things like that. But I immediately realized that was a new world with a new ontology, with also new forms of power. Around 10 years ago, I set up a council to keep track of all these things, and because I was always seeing that this would eventually lead to some kind of a smart governance or some kind of data-driven governance. And this, of course, happened in China because the politicians are engineers, basically already running the country like some kind of a platform.
I will say still a lot of uncertainty. Even China, the returning work is about 80-90% now, but the actual production rate is less than 30%. A lot of our customers in China have their order from Europe and US. So this actually have quite a huge chain reaction. From my own assessment, they have much better control on the disease as much more centralized, coordinated response in China. I will say that for the rest of the world, this will not be easy.
If data is the new oil, how will China and the US, locked in a new style of Cold War, manage data? As more breakthroughs emerge from 21st century technologies, the country that rules data will rule the world.
The supply chains are going to be shortened. The trade war had already started. Many companies moving manufacturing back to the US or at least to North America, and this just compounds that. And so you're going to see a lot less of what we were used to in terms of free trade, and you're going to see a lot more of what you mentioned in terms of robotics and all sorts of other changes to business models that basically separate people.
For now, a survey conducted in April by the American Chamber of Commerce in China found the majority of U.S. companies operating in China did not plan to move production and supply chains out of the country. Apple, for one, plans to deepen its supply chain in China. That said, as the pandemic reshapes our world, there could be a shakeup in industries of strategic importance as countries feel the effects of disrupted supply chains. As supply chains take a hit and supplier nations begin imposing export controls, do you think food security will emerge as Asia's next battle in a post-COVID world?
It's a frightening scenario that you paint if indeed we start turning inwards and shut down supply chains. There were those 24, 48 hours of concern when Malaysia first went into lockdown, we would no longer have available to us the supply chain of foods that we, up until now, have taken for granted coming across the border, trucked down from Thailand and the breadbasket of Asia. And we had this joint statement put forth by ASEAN Business Advisory highlighting the importance of sort of maintaining this cooperation and production agreement across nations, both in response to the COVID situation, but again, sort of reinforcing this agreement of cooperation. Singapore example, the government recently announced this 30 million acceleration grant to realize the 30 by 30 vision faster. So providing additional funding to local producers to ramp up production.
If we subscribe to the view that this is not our first and final pandemic that results in shutdowns and lockdowns, how urgent is food security for nations that don't produce enough to feed their populations like Singapore?
It's going to be critical. And actually, this is where I think the interplay with technology really shines through urban farming technologies and the sheer number of companies which have sprung up in the last few years that are now allowing cities like Singapore and Hong Kong and Dubai and London and Manhattan to be growing closer to the consumer. Vertical farming, controlled environment agriculture, even aquaculture, where you can set up an 8-story fish farm on land, recirculating aquaculture, or cell-based proteins. Simply, you need a bunch of bioreactors churning out the cell proliferation to be able to harvest enough ultimately meat product. We have the technologies available to us today, which is going to be the game changer to provide a secure source of food for cities and countries which otherwise, or in yesteryear, did not have that.
Every year, more than 9 million people die of hunger worldwide, according to the United Nations. That is the entire population of Austria. COVID-19's disruption of food supply chains risks doubling that number this year.
I think another 6, 9, 12 months of this will continue to have these things change. I don't have a dystopian view of how that's going to mean that we've now got half of society out of work. I think it's likely going to translate into different priorities for people and different priorities in terms of our society, and that generates lots of entrepreneurial opportunities that causes some businesses to adapt. And by the way, there's probably some very large companies that are not going to survive, and probably all this is doing is accelerating their demise.
Yes, there will be an impact. There will be a change. If anything, it now required us to have a realignment on the digital aspect of the work and the leverage of the data. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is whether we are willing to make that shift, whether we're willing to learn new roles, whether we're willing to take on new tasks, and whether we're willing to learn new skill sets. I think that is because even if you go back into now it's a century and a half to the Luddites, where you had the whole manufacturing line and everything, in every era, in every occurrence, there's always that message of, it's going to destroy jobs, it's going to put people out of employment, but yet there is always new jobs.
With the new paradigm on the horizon, can we imagine a way out of this crisis? How should we look at the world differently? How do we redesign ourselves to accommodate the new normal?
We should use this particular time, when the lockdowns close, to think about how we deal with the world differently, specifically with nature and the consequences of climate change. And we should now try to find technological solutions for a better world in this respect, because otherwise, just another virus is around the corner.
The amazing thing about AI and data science is that it is limited by our own imagination. As long as there's data, as long as there is a hypothesis of patterns, we can do something. So that's on the out. It's the inability that really caught me off guard. And I believe that myself, definitely, and others who are in the field of AI and data science kind of went, why aren't we doing this? We can do it. The technology allows it.
As profound pressures from COVID-19 accelerate the fourth industrial revolution, blurring the boundaries between the physical, digital, and biological worlds, perhaps there is a silver lining from the crisis. If the world was able to do the unthinkable, to slow a pandemic, it can do the same to fight climate change and give the planet a much-needed jolt towards sustainability.
If anybody's ever been on an airplane where you're sitting on the tarmac, the captain comes on and says, we're having a little problem with something. Some of the light has a blinking thing going on. We'll be back to you in 15 minutes. It comes back on. Well, the light's still blinking and we think we've got a mechanical thing. Now we have a fuel issue even though we fixed the light, and we'll be back to you in 15 minutes. Like 4 hours later, you're still sitting on the plane saying, why didn't they just cancel the damn thing or tell me it was going to be 4 hours and give me a choice? This is going to be 12 months, 18 months, and it's going to be hard and it's going to be distressing. When you're in a crisis, there's sort of the cliche from the thing in the airplane, like you have to take care of yourself. That's important. But put your energy into helping others around you. Allocate real effort into the broader dynamic versus just being insular and worrying about what's happening to you as the primary thing. That actually doesn't necessarily make things easier, but it lowers the anxiety enormously, and it allows you to be, at least for me, allows me to be much clearer thinking about what has impact and what doesn't.
Look, we've got to change the way we're organizing things here. We got to go to much more local production, which is really, really possible with good 3D printing and lots of IoT with lots of LoRa systems and sort of like this. It's so cheap, all this connectivity, that we should be able to sustain our basic needs and have some fun and organize some way of working with each other. And I hope that's something that will come out of this.
You see streamlined industries, but more importantly, you see much lower demand for probably years to come. I mean, think about travel. It's hard to imagine the level of travel that people used to do happening in the next year or two, or even 3. It's going to take time for people's comfort with traveling to come back, especially people over the age of 65, to the extent they're not immune to the virus. And then beyond that, people's pocketbooks have been hurt, and they'll probably continue to get hurt. And so some people aren't going to be comfortable traveling just from a financial perspective. So we're talking about years worth of disruptions and kind of a smaller industries all over the globe.
I think definitely this will not be what some of them mentioned. This is a V-shaped or even U-shaped return. I think this will be quite protracted and it will last quite long, as from some of the very early indicators in China, even though everyone kind of back to social norm, but the spending power, the restaurant are still not as full as before. So I think this will have a long-lasting impact. In general, I think the recovery time will be much longer.
We really need to learn from this. We need to take the opportunities and make them happen. I think it would be a grave error and sin that if and once all of this is behind us, we forget this. We forget the pain, we forget the difficulties, we forget the challenges, and we go back to what was truly the normal. We need to make this happen such that when such situations occur again, may they never happen. And again, let us put this technology in place to make sure that they're prevented as much as possible. That we don't again go, oh, we wish we had these capabilities in place. We wish we used the technology to its fullest potential. We need to simply be able to, we're using it to its fullest potential, and we're constantly discovering new ways that we can push the envelope effectively.
There will be a big shift towards resilience. What does government resilience look like? What does corporate resilience look like? What does community resilience? What does personal resilience look like? If we do, God forbid, but likely experience multiple waves of this, how do we tune up and tune back down and become more resilient with the resources, with the capabilities, with the type of work, the services that we expect, and with our needs as humans? So this question of preparedness, agility, and resilience, I think, is one that will become front and center in a post-COVID-19 world such as it is. It has been quite something to breathe the incredibly clean air and see animals running about and birds chirping in really a renewed way. And I think that this is also part of this kind of universal human experience that is part of this catastrophe. We pushed pause on the rat race and how it gets turned back on and what that means from a climate perspective and how it's tied to economic drivers.
I just want to emphasize the aspect of nature here. We're so small and we should use this time to reflect and create solutions that last beyond COVID-19. I would encourage every leader, every person on this planet, despite all the problems they're fighting every day and the incredible uncertainty everyone is facing and the fear they have to deal with, to find some space to create some hope for someone in your family or in your community, and to think not just about solving an immediate problem, but also about solving problems that surely will come back once COVID-19 has been under control.
Hope you've had much to take away over the past 5 weeks through this global conversation linking our thought leaders in Silicon Valley, Boulder, Stuttgart, Amsterdam, and Singapore. A big thank you to my guests: Toby Ruckert, founder and CEO of UIB; Jessica Groopman, founding partner of Kaleido Insights; AI and data scientist David Hardoon; Brad Feld, managing director and co-founder of Foundry Group; Rob Van Kranenburg, founder of the IoT Council; David Williams, founder and CEO of Williams Capital Advisors; Jeffrey Tiong, founder and CEO of PatSnap; plus John Friedman, Asia Director of Ag Funder. And I'm Chloe Cho. Thank you so much for tuning in to Maverick Dreamers and Thinkers.